everyone. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
So for those of you who have been following along with the series of talks that I've been doing for the last month, you are aware that today is Christmas Day to me, not weeks ago. If you've looked at a calendar, some calendars will actually say that today is the Orthodox Christmas. And in the last talk, we went over kind of the history of Christmas and why it's celebrated on the day that it is. And that most of the world, other than North America, actually celebrates Christmas today, not December 25th. That's more of a North American holiday over the last couple hundred years. So bits and pieces of what I kind of wanted to go over tonight were a bit of background on why that is that we celebrate Christmas on two different days and what it's really about. Other calendars, today is not Christmas, but today is the date of Epiphany. And typically speaking, if you're from a Catholic background, this is the mark of the end of the Christmas season. And it's also generally why people start to go back to work and go back to school and all the prices drop on flights. That usually happens about this weekend. So briefly, the history of why Christmas is on December 25th, for those who weren't here last time. This year was the 1684th anniversary of Christmas. What year is it?
2020.
Do those numbers match up? No. And yet it's supposed to be the anniversary of somebody's birthday, which was supposed to happen 2,000 years ago. And yet we're about a few hundred years shy of that. And the reason for it is because December 25th, 336, was Constantine's 64th birthday. That's what we're celebrating. So Constantine was known as the first Christian Catholic emperor of Rome. He was a convert, and for most historians, right from the beginning of when it happened to now, they contest that his conversion to Christianity was not authentic. It was a political maneuver. And so by celebrating Christ's birthday on his birthday, it equated, in people's minds, it put him on par with Christ. And so it was actually a manipulative political maneuver so that people would accept the emperor as the sovereign ruler ordained by God, which was a very Hebrew thing to do. They always claimed that the kings were ordained by God or anointed by God to have that position. And so he was capitalizing on that belief system of the Hebrew people who were at the time revolutionaries. So it's not exactly an arbitrary date, but it kind of is, because nobody really knows what day Christ was actually born on. Astronomically speaking, if you look at the stars, which people have done over the last couple hundred years, they've actually tried to figure out what was the Star of Bethlehem. It was the star that appeared out of nowhere for a short period of time, and it indicated the arrival of the Christ child, the anointed king who would save the world, the Messiah. And there are a few theories on that. And the primary theory that people invest in is that the Star of Bethlehem was actually a conversion of three different astronomical entities. Anyway, so Jupiter, Saturn, coming together. Now, when you're talking metaphysical teachings, Jupiter and Saturn are the two types of rulers. They represent the compassionate ruler and the more constructed ruler. And the third conversion was Regalis, which is one of the stars. And Regalis, it actually translates into King Star. And so when those three astronomical entities came and converged, it looked like one bright thing in the sky. And so retrospectively, they've used their computers now that can figure out when things converged, and they figured out a few potential dates. And so nowadays, we have a bit more of an understanding of when that would have happened. Before we had all of that technology available to us and those teachings available to us, if we just looked at the story in the Bible itself, it gave it all away. Tonight being Little King's Night is what the Spanish call it. January 6th is the celebration not of when Christ was born, but when the kings presented their gifts. The way the story is told in the Nativity, traditionally with the Catholic Church, is that the night he was born, 3 kings arrived. So that is Matthew 2, 1 to 12. That's the account in the Bible of the 3 kings, they say. Did anyone hear the word king? They were never referred to as kings. The other thing is, did anyone hear the word 3? The teaching that we're familiar with is Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar are their names. One wore a red cloak, one wore a black cloak, and one wore a green cloak. There's a lot of information, their skin color, everything is involved, including what countries they were kings of. None of that is from the Bible. None of that is recorded in history. All of it was added Middle Ages. No one knows where that information came from. It was just a fleshed out story to make it more connective. What the Bible actually says is that wise men arrived from the east, bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The assumption that there were 3 kings is because there were 3 gifts. All it says is there were more than one of them. That's it. We don't know how many there were. House is a good clue. They were living in a house. If you read the story about the birth of Christ, he was born in a manger. They couldn't even find a hotel room to stay in. So if you are living in a house, how long have you been staying in that town?
Long enough to live in a house.
Long enough to buy a house. So the other part of the Bible story that I didn't read is that the star appeared the night that he was born, and the shepherds started rejoicing and knew what it meant, and the angels showed up and told the shepherds, go to this little cave and here's the king. So we know that the star appeared when he was born. And it also said that the star stopped above the house. So if you read that word in Hebrew, it would translate as the star went away. Because if you're following a star, when does it stop? It stops when you stop moving, or if you move over 3 feet, the star just moved again and you're going to keep following it, right? The only way a star is going to stop is if it stops shining. So which means that the conversion moved out of faith. So if you're trying to reconcile when the 3 kings arrived and when the Christ child was born, you'd actually be looking, when did the conversion start and when did it go away? And the way that it works out is that, well, and the traditional teachings are that by the time the 3 kings arrived, he was probably about 2 years old. They had been in Jerusalem probably for almost 2 years. Because another part of the story is that, and it's actually the very next part of the story, is that King Herod wanted to kill the child. So then an angel appears to the wise men and tells them to go home a different way. Don't go back to Herod. He's not bringing the child gifts. He wants to kill him because that child's supposed to be a king who replaces Herod. He's not going to want to be friendly to him, right? So they are told to go a different way by an angel so that Herod can't find the child. But then Herod's command to his generals is to kill every child under the age of 2 years old. If they know when the king was born and they know he's a newborn, why do you have to kill everyone up to 2 years old? Because that's about how old the child is. Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report that the star's first appearance. So the star first appeared and they started following it 2 years before they met Herod. That's why. So that's why they read that he was actually 2 years old at the time, because we know from the other story about the shepherds that the star appeared out of nowhere the night he was born, and they went and met him that night as a newborn child. And then the wise men show up talking to Herod before they've met him. So they hadn't made it to the child yet. They met the king because they figured the king would know where to find him. They didn't know it was going to be this lowly child. They thought it was going to be a prince. They just knew that the Messiah king was born. They were expecting him to be royalty. And they arrived and they were sent to this like little manger, and they're like, okay. And they saw him and they're like, oh yeah, it's you. That's essentially how the story goes, the understanding of it. So the wise men told Herod, 2 years ago, the star appeared. It's the prophecy star. We followed it to Jerusalem because the scroll said that the king was going to be born in Jerusalem. We're here. Where's the king, child? And so he pulled all the scholars together, like the story said. He pulled all the scholars together. The meeting of the minds were like, okay, where should this child be? Oh, the child should be in Bethlehem. Great. Let's send those guys to Bethlehem to do all the footwork for us, and then get them to come back and tell us where the kid is. And then we'll take care of the kid. And so that part of the story is biblical. The part that isn't is that there were 3 kings. They're just referred to as wise men, and we aren't told how many there are. But they arrive, they say, 2 years ago we started following a star, and so if you actually do the math, but for the nativity scene to be shown in a 45-minute play by children on Christmas Eve, you got to condense the story, and that's the story everybody knows, that version. The way that the astrological conversions meet up is that January 6th is when the kings would have arrived. And that's why we celebrate in most of the world, except for North America, which is a Western, like if you think about history, Rome turned into Britain, turned into America, essentially, as far as rulers go. So we're a direct lineage back to the Roman belief about things. So that's why we still celebrate on the 25th. I always love when people say, we're getting out of touch with what Christmas is really about. And I'm like, do you know what Christmas is really about? Because December 25th, the very first Christmas, was essentially a combination between Arbor Day, Earth Day, and Victoria Day. That's what the first Christmas was. It's a combination of 2 Latin holidays, one of them being Saturnalia, which is basically an orgy fest feast of the season turning, and the Yule, the Yule, which is about the darkening of the year, where you bring the tree inside. And the whole reason we have a Christmas tree is because we would bring life into the home, because everything was getting dark and you were starting to lose that life force energy. And so a combination of that and the emperor's birthday. So that's what the original Christmas was. When we think about what Christmas actually means, and people talk about it being about the birth of the Savior, very little about the traditions we celebrate around Christmas have anything to do with that. Unless you happen to go to church and they read some scripture passages, which actually don't line up. So it's interesting. The most grounded traditions that we have in the Western world about Christmas are Santa Claus, the reindeer, the Christmas Carol, things like that, which are all within the last 150 years. Most of our traditions and the way that we function around holidays, the gathering of families, that's all Victorian age Britain. Most of them. So my challenge this year, seeing as today is the Orthodox version of Christmas, is for people to go back to what Christmas was really about, which was the gifts of the kings, coming to recognize who someone was. So the child was born. He was already coming of age and becoming his own person, because about 2 years old, when you're walking, you're starting to make sounds. It might not make sense, but you're starting to be able to articulate, which meant that a 2-year-old could have actually greeted the wise men and recognized them and looked them in the eye and made them feel seen. He would have been recognizable for who he was by that time. He was starting to become who he was. 2 more years and he'd be weaned, but still. So that's really what Christmas is about. It's about people from the outside coming and recognizing who you really are and what the gift is. And in our last talk, we talked about what the gifts were: the frankincense, myrrh, and gold. And there was a challenge for people to spend the 2 weeks up until the Epiphany to look through their life and recognize where they were those gifts to the world. So briefly, myrrh is a painkiller. And the teaching is usually that the painkiller is provided to Mary, who would have just given birth. But if it's 2 years later, it's not for her after childbirth. It's for him, for his sacrifice that he's going to make. They're recognizing, we know your story, we know how this is going to go, and we're preparing you for it. Frankincense was the traditional incense that was burned in the synagogues, and it was the incense that was used to signify that worship was happening. And so frankincense was about worship. It was about the lifting up of energy and consciousness and connecting with God. And then gold is usually, now scholars are contesting that it was misinterpreted. The gold wasn't literal. Metal gold was not nearly as precious then as it is now. It was pretty available at the time. And the belief is that it was actually, seeing as the other two were resins, the third, actually one of the most precious materials in the world at the time, was sandalwood resin. And so the third gift would be sandalwood, which, as you can see, is gold colored. And so the 3 gifts of the wise men were myrrh, frankincense, gold, and that's what they represented. Gold signified that you were important and you had value, and that gifts of value would be given to you in recognition of the reciprocation of what you had to offer. Frankincense was about being in worship and being in communion with God, and myrrh was about helping to ease the pain of what the journey was going to look like. And the challenge for the last month, and for those who weren't there but want to continue forward, is to look at the places in your life where you were that for someone else, or where you received those types of gifts. If that makes sense. The other part of the story that doesn't really make sense, the way that it's traditionally interpreted, is that the 3 kings are believed to be from the Orient. They came on camels. So let's just start there. So they packed up their camels and had a convoy to Jerusalem. Where do camels live? Do they live in the East? Do they live in the Oriental countries? Africa, Middle East. So they may have come from the East, but they definitely weren't Oriental if they came on camels, because there aren't a lot of camels in the Orient. Frankincense and myrrh, if those were the gifts that were the most precious items that their countries had to offer, you're talking Persia and Arabia. Gold at the time was from Egypt, which isn't East at all. So traditionally speaking, scholars believe that the 3 wise men were the best of the best intellectually from their own areas. One was Persian, one was Arabian, and one was Egyptian. And they had come together to work with their different specialties. The belief is one was an astronomer, one was a scientist, one was a chemist, those kinds of things, scholars. And that they were working together trying to interpret prophecies. And so when they saw the star, they're like, that star means something. We know that that means something. They didn't know what they were looking for. They saw the star and they're like, oh, there's a prophecy about a star. I think I know where this is going. And they put it together, they jumped on their camels, and off they went. And they arrived. They didn't come because they were believers looking for the Messiah. They came because they recognized the star meant something. And on their journey, they figured out what that meant, and they arrived. So it's very interesting that the people who showed up to recognize Yeshua for who and what he was weren't Hebrew, weren't Christian, weren't from the area. weren't expecting Messiah, weren't wanting to be saved. They were people who knew what he was and recognized it from the outside. That's why they say they came from far. Because they were people who come from a tradition that weren't expecting him and knew he was there. But then you look at how the Hebrews reacted to him. They weren't nearly as welcoming. And one of my favorite quotes from the Bible is, a prophet is never recognized in his own home. And that's exactly what this night, the little King's Night, is about. We're never recognized for our greatest gifts in our own home because the people around us need us to be something and can't see what we're showing them. And I've done a lot of talks about that. So when we're looking for the gifts that we are to people, look for the unusual ways that it's reflected to you. Look to the strangers who can be the voice of God, because usually the ones closest to you can't. You can talk to, you're blue in the face trying to tell them that something about you has changed, and they hold you accountable to who you used to be. And so the night of the kings, the night of the wise men, is all about that, being recognized for what you really are, the gift that you really are, and being shown how valuable you are. That's what Christmas is supposed to be about. So it's always interesting to me that people talk about how we've lost touch with what Christmas is really about by going commercial, but it was always about the gifts. It was never about getting, it was always about the giving. Because the gifts that you give should really show the person that you have seen them. You know who they are, you know what they're doing. They are recognized, they are witnessed, and they are valued. That's what the night's supposed to be about. So, that's where we start the conversation. And now it turns into an actual conversation. That was my kind of sermon about it. In the Catholic tradition, today is called the Epiphany. And the reason for the Epiphany is because, like, the solstice and the Christmas era, everything's quiet, it goes dark, it goes inside. It's the darkest time of the year because the days are the shortest. But about January 6th is when days start to get recognizably longer. It starts to get that little bit warmer. Even though the temperature is dropping, we feel like it's warmer because the sun is stronger. And so January 6th is where the light starts to come back into the world. And that's one of the reasons why it's remarkable that the astronomical conversion of when the kings would have arrived would have actually been the day that it starts to get lighter. That to me is beautiful. Especially if them arriving meant that the star stopped shining and it's the day it got brightest. Because that's actually how Christ's life went. It wasn't until he died that people started to recognize what he was, and his light started to really shine into the world and make the changes it was going to. It's never too late to have impact. Anyway, so the Epiphany is all about that light bulb turning on. And just literally, Epiphany means that moment of realization. And that is definitely the prayer of the new year that I have for everyone, is that this year is just full of epiphanies. Especially epiphanies about who you really are and what your value really is. I want everyone to be blessed this year with an endless amount, copious amounts of epiphanies of what your 3 gifts are. Not you only have 3 gifts, but the 3 types of gifts. You can have a bazillion gifts in each one of those 3 categories. That's the invitation. A practice that I would like to challenge people into, let me know later in the year who took it up, is that every day you pinpoint, recognize one of those 3 categories of gifts that either you received or you were recognized as. That's the challenge. Every day, one of the 3 gifts. Keep your mind focused on that, and you're really going to have epiphanies.